So we've been talking a little bit about how identity can drive conflict. And I think it's worth spending a little bit more time talking about that in the context of ethnic violence, primarily within civil wars. So wars between states have primarily disappeared as a feature of the international system. Since the end of the Cold War, we've had very few conflicts in which two countries are actually at war with each other, right? So there's the Iraq War in 1991, there's the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, US invasion of Afghanistan in 2002, NATO bombing of Kosovo, Russia invades Georgia in 2006. There's a conflict between India and Pakistan. That's pretty much it, unless we start relaxing the definition on what war constitutes. And most of those conflicts actually end up revolving around a civil war that's already ongoing. So the vast majority of conflicts that we do see in which one country is attacking another country end up being, one, pretty rare, and two, being related to civil wars. By contrast, of the 160 or so civil wars that we've seen since the end of World War II, roughly a third happened in the 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So civil wars are a much more prominent feature of the international system today. They're very common, and I think it's worth understanding some of the dynamics that drive that. So when we try to explain civil wars, there's a variety of stories that we tell or theories that we tell. And I'm going to run through a couple of the most prominent or popular theories. And again, with theories, some theories can be useful in some contexts, in other contexts. Some are very useful in all contexts. Those are the ones we really want to latch onto. And some might not be useful at all. And so I think I'll start with one of those that tends not to be all that useful, but still gets talked about quite a bit. So there's this ancient hatreds thesis, and it's essentially an argument that identity for a group is rooted deep in the DNA of people. And that DNA is not just sort of who they are, but also who they hate. And the idea is that over the course of millennia, groups grew up in competition with each other and learned to hate each other. And so the thinking is that when you see conflict emerging between people from two different groups, it's because they have this deep biological DNA-rooted animosity toward each other, and they're fighting because they hate each other, and they've always hated each other, and they always will hate each other, and that's just the way it is. And certainly when we look at conflicts like what breaks out in Bosnia in the early 1990s, or the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, there's a temptation to say, well, this thing seems to have a long history. It must be ancient hatreds. But I think that misses important details and more important facts about that conflict dynamic, right? Ancient hatred works really well as a theory of conflict, right? It's simple. Parsimonious would be what political scientists refer to it as. But it doesn't do a very good job of explaining periods of peace. And in fact, while you can have conflict between groups that stretches on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, you also get long periods of peace where groups aren't at each other's throats. And ancient hatreds really doesn't have a way of explaining that. And so I'll give you the example of Bosnia, where ancient hatreds really became a prominent sort of theory, and people were really talking about it in sort of the popular discussion. In the early 1990s, Bosnia descends into really brutal ethnic cleansing. But in the 1980s, under the sort of umbrella of Yugoslavia, Bosnia was a inter-ethnic melting pot. Roughly 1/3 of all marriages crossed ethnic lines. We had Serbs marrying Bosnian Muslims. We had Bosnian Muslims marrying Croats. We had Croats marrying Serbs. It was a very diverse, it was a very interconnected place. It wasn't a place where people were seething with these deep hatreds and desire to kill each other, but something happened in the 1990s that sort of changed that dynamic. And so we can explain the killing, but we can't explain decades of intermarriage, right? These are not people who are at a biological level prone to hatred of others. Something else is going on. So when we're trying to understand that something else that's going on, some political scientists shift the focus to elites. In fact, there's this argument that says that the reason why we see people turning on each other and group being pitted against group is because it benefits elites. And so elites are manipulating the system. They're using nationalistic rhetoric. They're whipping up fear of others or outsiders or what they're going to do of this other group. And they're doing it for political gain. They're doing it to cement support behind themselves. And so I think probably the classic example of this in the US context is George Wallace. George Wallace is a politician from Alabama, and in 1958 he runs for governor of Alabama and he loses. He runs as a moderate. He ran in Alabama in 1958. That means that he's not a hardline segregationist. His opponent has the Klan backing him, arguing for segregation. And George Wallace comes out of that political process in 58 and says, the problem was I was not virulently pro-segregation. Never again will I get outsegged. And so he becomes the segregationist candidate. He fights for it with the most vile and hateful rhetoric. And in 1962, that vile and hateful rhetoric brings him into the governorship. He then takes his pro-segregationist, anti-civil rights message on the road, runs for president in 64. Meanwhile, his wife is elected to his seat in the governor's mansion in 66. He comes back and gets elected in 1970. He gets shot. Apparently in the process, he finds Jesus, repents for the hatred that he spewed for a decade or more. And in 1982, he runs for governor again in Alabama. But in 1982, Alabama is a very different place. It's not a place in which segregation is an issue. Segregation has been done for more than a decade, almost a decade and a half. The efforts to suppress African Americans as a share of the voting bloc in Alabama have largely been broken up because of the Voting Rights Act. And now you can't effectively win in Alabama without engaging with the African American community. And George Wallace does the mental calculation and realizes that if he's going to win, he needs African Americans. And so he reaches out to leaders in the African American community and he tells a story. He said, look, I was wrong. I was horrible to you, but we have common interests and common concerns. Work with me. I will work with you. And he gets elected in 1982 with the backing of the African American community, and actually is a very inclusive governor in Alabama at that time. So this is not a man who's principled. This is not a man who has a vision for policy. This is somebody who will do anything it takes to maintain power, to bring together the people he needs to support him, to hold on to power, and he will do that regardless of who gets hurt in the process or what damage he does to society. And that's the story of elite manipulation. And actually, we see this process of elite manipulation playing out pretty consistently across countries, and works really well in that Yugoslavia case with Bosnia, where you have leaders like Slobodan Milosevic, who began whipping up fear of what the Croats might do to the Serbian people, and whipping up fear about how the Serbian people have been betrayed under Ottoman rule and all of these wrongs that have been done to them, and mobilizes the Serbian population around the idea that Slobodan Milosevic is the leader that can protect the Serbian people and will do whatever it takes, no matter who gets hurt, to protect the Serbian people. And so this idea that elites are the cornerstone of this process is, I think, a pretty powerful theory in that it seems to fit some pretty important cases and does a pretty good job. We could also tell a story about frustration aggression. And again, this is one of these theories that's out there in the popular consciousness, but when we dig into it, it doesn't seem to work quite as well. So the basic idea is that groups feel that they're losing out or that they're oppressed. And there's that sort of anger that builds up because of oppression, and you rise up and try to overthrow your oppressors or seek independence, or there's some sort of violence that results from that frustration, right? That frustration leads to aggression. And again, this is one of these things that seems really intuitive. It seems to make sense. But when we look at the data, it doesn't actually do a good job of explaining why people rise up. In fact, when we crunch the numbers, it turns out the people with the most grievances, the people who are the most oppressed, the people who are the bottom of the economic and political and social totem pole, rarely, if ever, rise up. That the vast majority of sort of agitation against the system tends to come from people who are at the level of having education and resources and connections, having power and privilege, but not being quite able to break through into that elite sphere and feeling sort of boxed out. And so they're able to mobilize the resources they have and push against that. It's not that grievances are the driver, it's that there's something more going on. A slight adaptation of that frustration aggression thesis, which says I am oppressed, therefore I'm going to lash out, is the closing window thesis, which is maybe a special case. Instead of the backward looking, I have been oppressed, I'm going to lash out, it's forward looking. I might be oppressed, and therefore I'm going to lash out. And so the logic of this is that things are going along and they're fine. And all of a sudden something happens to disrupt the state, right? You have a state collapse or there's a crisis or a revolution. And all of a sudden there are ethnic minorities within that state who are looking around thinking, okay, the state just collapsed. Things are completely in flux right now. What do we do at this moment in time? And they have a decision to make. They can either make a break for freedom, right? Try to rebel and carve off their own independent state, right? Achieve self-determination. Or they can sort of go along with the rebuilding of what was before, right? And there's an effort that to rebuild the state and reconstitute authority. And every day that goes by, the police force gets reorganized. And every day that goes by, the military gets sort of trained up. And every day that goes by, the tax infrastructure gets put in place. And every day that goes by, the prospect of rebellion declines. Well, you can rebel, but your prospects of success decline. And so facing that moment of crisis, that moment of uncertainty, that moment of opportunity, groups might do the calculation that says, I don't know what the future is going to hold. In the future, my group, my community, my people might be oppressed. Maybe at the moment, I don't see that. Maybe at the moment, the other political actors are saying, no, we would never do that. That's not our intention. We want to treat you fairly and treat you well. But how do I know? In the future, we could get a demagogue, we could get a George Wallace type figure coming to power, and then my group is going to suffer, and we would have no chance of escape. But now, in this moment, conditions are ripe. If we make a break for freedom now, we might actually succeed. But every day that passes, the window closes. And so there becomes incredible pressure to move now while the window's open rather than to wait. A final story that we can tell about ethnic conflict and why ethnic conflict breaks out also centers on that idea of a moment of crisis, right? That something has happened, the state has been disrupted, and all of a sudden people aren't sure what's going to happen. And so this theory works a little bit differently. It's the emerging anarchy theory, and it says that as states break down, right, people's lives become anarchic, like the international system, right, which is anarchic. There's no central authority, and there's no international 911 service, right? If you get into trouble in the international system, you can't call and get help from the police. Well, when a state starts breaking down, that dynamic becomes real for people in their everyday lives. There's no one you can call for help because there's no state authority to enforce order. And the second element is that groups view each other with not necessarily hostility, right? This isn't ancient hatreds where groups hate each other, but at least suspicion. Maybe people live in less diverse neighborhoods, or maybe there's not good communication between groups. Maybe there's a history in the past that was a little bit contentious. There's at least a kernel of suspicion there. Groups are also somewhat intermingled, right? We looked at those maps of Europe and of Southeast Asia and ethnic linguistic populations, and we saw how you can have little pockets of one language surrounded by another language, or you can have cities that are very diverse and are not easily separated out. You can have that diversity running not just in cities, but in neighborhoods and blocks and literal apartment buildings. And because of that mixture of anarchy, no one to call if you get into trouble, a low level of suspicion, and the geography of intermingled groups, people can start asking the most dangerous question possible. What would happen if? What would happen if there was violence here? What would happen if there was chaos and destruction and I had to flee my home? I would lose everything. I'd lose my job, I'd lose my home, the playground where my children play, the cemetery where my family is buried. Everybody I know would be lost. And I can't allow for that to happen. And so as people start working through that what would happen if kind of calculation, they come to the realization that the only way to head off those horrible outcomes is to strike first and to solidify control over territory and neighborhoods and push out people from other groups. And so we can see that logic of chaos driving people to turn on their neighbors. I don't like this story. I like the elite manipulation story, right? That's a story in which there are bad people out there, leaders who are manipulating good people, the everyday, ordinary people that I meet on the street. Emerging anarchy is a theory in which the bad people are the people we meet on the street. It's not everyday leaders that are manipulating us into this. It's our own fears and our own uncertainties and our own reactions to anarchy that result in these dynamics. And there's some pretty powerful evidence for this theory. This is a series of maps and data prepared by General Jim Jones. He presented to Congress to explain what was happening in Iraq at the height of the Iraqi insurgency. And it's a little bit hard to read, but there's a couple things going on. One is that the Iraqi insurgency is really ramping up in the second half of 2006. And then all of a sudden in 2007, by about March, really settles down and violence just is on the decline. But when you look into Baghdad and what's going on in Baghdad, we can see that pattern with sort of the blotchiness, right? The yellow and the red blotchy stuff is showing sort of where the violence in Baghdad is happening. And you can see that in July 2006, it's really intense across a big part of the city, and there's those red areas where things are really bad. And then by July 2007, the blotchiness is kind of gone and the reds are gone. It's just a little bit of yellow. But what's happening underneath is the changing nature of these neighborhoods. And so what ends up happening is you have the green areas, which are predominantly Shia, and the blue neighborhoods, and there's a few up there in sort of the northern part of Baghdad, which are predominantly Sunni. But the most of Baghdad in July 2006 is predominantly mixed Sunni Shia neighborhoods. That's sort of the orangish areas. And in July 2006, the Mahdi army, a Shia militia, is going door by door by door and hunting down Sunnis, driving them from their homes, seizing their property, taking their apartments. And those Sunnis that are able to escape that violence, that ethnic cleansing from the northern part of Baghdad, where the Mahdi army is based in Sadr City, they flee to the south. They flee to the other side of the river, and they tell their friends and their family who are living in predominantly Sunni neighborhoods, the Shias are ethnically cleansing our communities. And so that southern part of Baghdad is almost exclusively mixed ethnic neighborhoods. But by January 2007, things are really changing. You can see that Sadr City, that northern part, has turned from orange to almost exclusively green. And you see that those little kernels of Sunni neighborhoods on the other side of the river in the south are growing and expanding as Sunnis are mobilizing and driving the Shias from their communities. And by July 2007, Baghdad's a completely different city. The mixed ethnic neighborhoods are gone. On the sort of north and western part of Baghdad, you have Shia neighborhoods, and in the south and east, you have Sunni neighborhoods, and the river cuts through the center and keeps them apart, provides security, provides a sense of protection. There are a handful of neighborhoods that survive that ethnic cleansing. And you can see them. There are little pockets of orange neighborhoods that don't have violence, but yet are still maintaining that mixed ethnic character. Those neighborhoods, by and large, are able to avoid ethnic cleansing because they have US soldiers and Marines manning barricades. They've been walled off from the rest of the city by concrete barricades, and coalition forces stand at the entrance, searching every vehicle, checking for guns, arresting militants, preventing the violence from surging into those neighborhoods. And people in those neighborhoods look at their neighbors and say, out there, beyond these walls, Sunnis and Shias are killing each other, but in here we're safe. I'm not worried about you. I don't feel like I have to turn on you. In fact, that would probably be a really bad idea given the fact that we're walled off and surrounded by US soldiers. The ethnic character, the mixed integration of those neighborhoods is able to survive because those areas have security.